Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Marcus Hargrove called her under his breath when she passed through the break room door on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He said it loud enough for 3 residents to hear, soft enough that she couldn't technically report it. Just a nurse asking questions about my patient orders. He smiled at the younger doctors, the kind of smile that made them nervous in ways they couldn't name. Natalie Hayes didn't stop walking. She filled her coffee mug, chipped ceramic with a faded logo, and turned back toward the ICU corridor. 18 months at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver, and nobody really knew who she was. That was exactly how she preferred it. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something deeper underneath, the copper and salt smell of blood mixed with industrial cleaner. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their endless drone, the kind of sound that would drive most people insane after a few shifts. Natalie had stopped hearing it somewhere around month 3. Now the sound was just the background rhythm of the ICU, same as the ventilators and the cardiac monitors and the 4 pumps that beeped in synchronized patterns like a strange mechanical orchestra. She moved through the unit with the kind of invisible competence that made her easy to overlook. 5 feet 2 inches tall, dark hair always pulled back into the same practical braid, hands that moved with surgical precision when she was working but stayed still and quiet everywhere else. The other nurses barely spoke to her anymore. Word had gotten around from Hargrove's office about something, some warning, though Natalie had learned long ago not to ask questions about office politics. In her previous life, the one that didn't exist according to 7 different government databases, asking too many questions got people killed. It was 2:53 p.m. when Mr. Garrett's chart came across her desk. 73-year-old male, post-operative cardiac bypass, recovering in ICU Bay 7. The surgical notes were clean. The vitals looked stable. His medication list was thorough and properly documented. Except for one order that made her eyes stop moving. Nitroprusside. Sodium nitroprusside. 0.8 micrograms per kilogram per minute, which for a man of Mr. Garrett's weight translated to a dosage that exceeded Sacred Heart's own documented protocol threshold by nearly 40%. The order was signed by Dr. Marcus Hargrove. The timestamp showed 1:14 a.m., 3 hours before the nursing shift change, when oversight was lightest. Natalie didn't move for exactly 12 seconds. She sat in the charting station with the monitor screen glowing in front of her, and her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for the phone. Only noticeable if you were watching closely. Only noticeable if you knew what to look for. Nobody at Sacred Heart knew what to look for. She walked to ICU Bay 7 where Mr. Garrett was sleeping under a light blanket, his chest rising and falling with the help of the ventilator, and she checked his full line. The medications were queued, waiting for the shift to officially start. She looked at the dopamine infusion, the propofol drip, the vasopressor medications. All the tools to keep a broken heart beating while it healed. And then the sodium nitroprusside, the medication that would push his already taxed system into deeper crisis. The Garrett family had posted a photograph on the board above his bed. Mr. Garrett with his daughter, his son, 3 grandchildren. He was smiling in the photo, his arm around the smallest of the grandchildren, a girl no more than 5 years old. The kind of smile that comes from people who have no idea they're in a photograph. Natalie walked back to the main nursing station and found Dr. Hargrove standing near the medication dispensary, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light as he reviewed another patient's chart. His shoes were polished. His hospital coat fit him like it had been tailored. He looked like the kind of man who had never had to truly wait for anything in his life. Dr. Hargrove. Her voice was quiet. It had to be. If she let it get louder, if she let anything sharp creep in, people listened too closely. Mr. Garrett's sodium nitroprusside dosage, it exceeds the protocol threshold. He turned. His eyes moved down to her, actually had to move downward because of the difference in their heights, and something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to curiosity, the way a person might look at a small animal that had just done something unexpected. Is that so? He didn't phrase it as a question. The timestamp shows you were the last to access that file, Doctor. She kept her voice level. Clinical. The kind of voice a nurse uses to report a vital sign change. The current order exceeds our documented maximum by 38%. For a moment, Hargrove didn't move. The break room was visible from where they stood, through the glass partition. 3 residents. 2 attending physicians. A young pharmacy tech restocking the automated medication dispensary. Everyone pretending they weren't watching the small nurse and the tall doctor have a conversation near the Pyxis machine. "That will be adjusted immediately, Miss Hayes," Hargrove said, his voice warm as honey, and he made a note on his tablet with the kind of deliberate gesture designed to be observed. "Thank you for the eagle eye. We need people like you catching these details." She nodded once and turned back toward the ICU bays. Behind her, she could feel his eyes on the back of her head. Could feel something shifting in the air like a barometric pressure drop before a storm. But she had bigger problems. In her jacket pocket, under the scrubs and the badge clipped to her collar, there was a faded piece of military-issue fabric about the size of a playing card. Unit patch. Stitched with military precision into the jacket lining where nobody would ever find it unless they were looking. She'd cut it from her original jacket 14 months ago, when she first understood that Natalie Hayes was only a new identity, a cover, a way to disappear. The name on that patch would send federal agents to Sacred Heart before her shift ended if anyone ever found out. The next morning, Natalie came in for the 6 a.m. shift and found the break room had shifted somehow. The dynamics had changed overnight, the way a school of fish changes direction without any visible signal. She poured her coffee from the pot, always bitter, always made by the night shift, and left to sit, and sat at the table in the corner with her chart review work. One by one, the other nurses got up and left. The room emptied within 3 minutes. The young resident who usually sat across from her for morning briefings suddenly needed to check on another floor. The charge nurse, Sarah, who had actually been friendly for about 2 weeks, found urgent business at the supply desk. Hargrove had moved fast. That was the first thing Natalie understood. That was the mark of a predator, not the speed of the strike, but the intelligence in the preparation. She made a note in the medication file that she'd flagged the dosage error. She documented the time, the dosage, the threshold exceedance, and the fact that she'd verbally reported it to the attending physician. Everything by protocol. Everything documented. Everything that said, "I was doing my job." The charge nurse Sarah came back into the break room about an hour later, and Natalie watched the calculation happen in real time across the woman's face. Sarah looked at her, really looked at her, the way people look at someone they've been told to avoid, and then sat down 3 seats farther away than before. "Dr. Hargrove was looking for you earlier," Sarah said. She was folding up some paperwork, not actually needing anything from the break room. "He mentioned he wanted to talk about your performance review." Natalie didn't respond. She drank her coffee. The room hummed with the silence of people who were in the same space but had been instructed, subtly, through the kinds of whisper campaigns that worked in hospitals where hierarchy was everything, to exist separately. That was when Eddie Ramirez came through the ER doors at 11:34 a.m. with a laceration on his left forearm that was actively bleeding through a construction site towel. 68 years old, retired Army combat medic, and what he didn't know was that his arrival would change everything the very moment Natalie Hayes looked at his wound and muscle memory took over. The ER attending, a young doctor named Chen, was checking an EKG in Trauma Bay 2. The senior resident was on a call. The wound care nurse was in the middle of suturing a pediatric laceration in Bay 1. Which meant when Eddie was brought to Bay 3, the person who reached him first was a 5'2" ICU nurse who had been trained to assess threats and stop bleeding in combat field hospitals where the ambient temperature was 127 degrees Fahrenheit and the screaming never stopped. "I'm okay, just need some stitches," Eddie was saying, but Natalie could see the artery involvement in the way the blood was moving. Not gushing, controlled, steady, which meant the pressure was stable but the vessel was definitely compromised. A ruptured radial artery didn't wait for. "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. The needle went in and came out, the thread moving through tissue with the kind of muscle memory that 14 months of being just a nurse couldn't erase. Couldn't ever erase. training program, she said, which was technically true. The Naval Medical Institute and then 18 months of field medicine in places where the training took on a different kind of urgency. Eddie was quiet for a long moment. He watched her work for another minute, then he whispered something so quietly that nobody but her could have heard. "I've only seen field surgeons stitch like that." She didn't respond. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds and pressed one finger to her lips, the oldest gesture in any language. The do not speak signal that every person who'd ever served in a combat zone understood on an instinctive level. By the time Dr. Chen came back to check on the suturing, the work was done. The radial artery was secured. The wound was closed with perfect symmetric stitches that would leave almost no scar. Eddie was sitting upright, the wound cleaned and wrapped, already looking better than he had 20 minutes earlier. "Excellent work," Dr. Chen said, looking at the suturing. He was already moving his attention to something else, one of those attending physicians who saw efficiency and moved on without asking too many questions. "Can you finish the paperwork?" "Already done," Natalie said. And she had been 2 pages of wound assessment, depth notation, arterial involvement, and closure method, all documented in the kind of precise medical language that made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. She stripped off her gloves and stepped back. Eddie was looking at her with the expression of someone who had just realized they were standing in the same room as a ghost. But the moment had already passed. The work was done. The threat assessment pattern in her eyes had been in his eyes 3 seconds and gone, and now she was just a nurse again, a 5'2" woman in green scrubs moving toward the door. What Natalie didn't know was that Eddie Ramirez was going to remember exactly how she moved. What Dr. Hargrove didn't know was that his carefully constructed whisper campaign had just met its match in a construction worker's gratitude and observational skills. And what Dr. Marcus Hargrove absolutely did not understand, sitting in his office at 2:15 p.m. reviewing her personnel file and making notes for the board, was that he had just activated the single most dangerous person in the hospital by trying to disappear her. He had no idea what she was. And he was about to make a catastrophic mistake. Dr. Hargrove's voice carried into the hallway like an air raid siren, and every head in the ICU turned toward Mr. Garrett's room. Natalie's hand stilled on the stand. She'd been adjusting the drip rate, a meticulous task requiring the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her civilian life, when the door swung open hard enough to bang against the wall. Hargrove held a chart in one fist like a weapon. "Nurse Hayes, explain this." His voice had that particular timbre of public humiliation, loud enough that it wasn't a question anymore, it was a performance. The Garrett family stood bedside, the adult daughter in a blazer, the son in scrubs from his own shift at Boulder Community. Both of them froze. "You documented the wrong dosage. Do you understand you could have killed this man?" The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above them. Natalie's fingers didn't shake. She'd received worse reprimands in a desert compound where the temperature hit 127 degrees and the sound of IED blasts made conversation impossible. She turned to face him with the kind of stillness that wasn't submission, it was the calm that comes from having already survived the worst. One tear formed. Just one. It slid down her cheek like a concession to the script he was writing, but her eyes never left his. She wiped it away with the back of her hand before it could fall again. "I don't know how you passed your boards, Ghost, that's what we call her, she's invisible until she makes a mistake, but this is unacceptable." Hargrove's words fell like stones into water, rippling through the room. The Garrett daughter gasped. The son's jaw tightened. Hargrove stood there, waiting for Natalie to crumble, to apologize, to give him the satisfaction of her breaking. Instead, her voice came out steady and surgical. "The timestamp shows you were the last to access that file, Doctor. At 2:36 a.m. Each word was a scalpel. Clean. Precise. Lethal in its accuracy. Hargrove's jaw worked. His grip on the chart tightened until his knuckles went white. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and left the room without another word. Behind him, the silence was so thick you could operate in it. Mr. Garrett stared at his full line. His daughter looked at Natalie with something that might have been respect or might have been fear of what she'd just witnessed. Natalie returned to the drip rate. 47 milliliters per hour. Steady. Documented. Correct. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. 3 days later, the break room was a study in social ostracism. Natalie sat with her lunch, turkey sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, at the far table by the window that overlooked Denver's gray sprawl. Nurse Amy walked in, saw her, and hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but long enough. Amy's eyes drifted toward the hallway where Hargrove was visible through the glass partition, talking to a resident, his hand making dismissive gestures. Amy chose a different table. Then 2 other nurses followed, their body language the kind of unconscious choreography that happens when a predator marks its prey and the herd responds. Within 90 seconds, Natalie sat alone in a room with 8 empty chairs. She took one measured breath. Opened her book, a dog-eared copy of Marcus Aurelius that had been in her rucksack for 6 years. Ate her sandwich with the same mechanical efficiency she used for everything else. No one approached. No one made eye contact. The break room's fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled into their usual hum. She finished her apple, drank her water, and returned to the ICU. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. But her left hand trembled once, just once, as she closed her locker, and she pressed it flat against the metal door until the shaking stopped. The humiliation escalated like a fever. The next day, Hargrove posted a fabricated disciplinary write-up on the public unit board where shift schedules lived alongside birthday announcements and a flyer for the annual blood drive. Official hospital letterhead. Red ink. The words formed a narrative that had nothing to do with reality, repeated documentation errors and unprofessional conduct. Employee is to receive formal written warning and mandatory retraining. His signature was sharp enough to cut. Natalie stood before it during shift change when 15 staff members flowed past in the hallway. Every eye that glanced at the board seemed to find her simultaneously. Charge Nurse Wilson whispered something to a resident, her voice low. Hargrove's been after her for weeks. The resident nodded like this was medical knowledge, like this explained everything. Natalie unpinned the write-up, folded it once along its crease, and placed it in her scrub pocket. Her movements were methodical. She didn't crumple it. She didn't tear it. She simply removed it from the public sphere and walked back to her rounds. From the medication room, Dr. Hargrove watched her. His phone was already at his ear. She heard his voice as she passed. "Yes, I'll hold. I need to speak with someone in HR about a compliance issue." And then the emergency alert came through at 2:14 p.m. The call came in from the ER, incoming trauma, arterial laceration, construction accident, ETA 3 minutes. Hargrove was occupied in a closed-door meeting with 2 board members, something about hospital efficiency metrics and cost optimization. Natalie was available. Eddie Ramirez came in on a stretcher with his left forearm wrapped in a blood-soaked construction site tourniquet and the kind of focus pain that only came from military background. 67 years old, silver beard, eyes that had seen Iraq during Desert Storm as an Army combat medic, 68 whiskey, the kind of medic who knew more about keeping people alive than most surgeons. His laceration was deep, 3 inches, jagged, dirty, the kind that needed irrigation and precision suturing to avoid permanent nerve damage. Natalie moved into the trauma bay like something choreographed by violence and repetition. Gloved hands. Sterile field. The suture kit laid out with the kind of spatial awareness that came from a career that didn't just involve hospitals. She irrigated the wound first, washing out the contamination with normal saline, her movements economical and exact. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Then came the debridement, removing the damaged tissue with a surgical technique that made Eddie watch her more carefully through his pain-narrowed eyes. She placed the first suture with perfect tension distribution, the needle going in at a precise angle, the knot tied with the kind of efficiency that spoke of doing this not in civilian operating rooms but in field conditions, in darkness, under fire, when speed and accuracy meant the difference between a soldier going home or going home in a flag-draped box. The second suture followed the same pattern. The third. By the fifth suture, Eddie was no longer watching her hands, he was studying her face, trying to read something in the set of her jaw, the focus in her eyes. "I've only seen field surgeons stitch like that," Eddie whispered, his voice rough with understanding and something else. Something like recognition. Real combat medics. Tactical environment training. "You stitch like you learned it on a deployment." Natalie finished the suture and tied it off. She met his eyes with the kind of quiet dignity that came from not needing to defend herself anymore, from being past the point of explanation. She pressed one finger to her lips. Not a threat. Not anger. Just a request for silence that carried the weight of classified information, of things that couldn't be unsaid, of an identity that was supposed to be erased. Eddie nodded slowly. He understood. 23 years in the military taught a man to recognize when someone was telling you something without words, when the hierarchy of secrecy meant you asked no questions and volunteered no information. "Roger that, Senior Chief," he said quietly. Natalie's eyes widened for half a second, not at the words themselves, but at the rank recognition. Not a guess. Not a suspicion. Certainty. The absolute identification of someone who'd been trained to read insignia and bearing and the specific way a person carried themselves when they'd spent a decade carrying lives on their shoulders. She looked away. Finished documenting his vitals, blood pressure 138/82, heart rate 76, no shock, wound irrigation complete, sutures 5-0 nylon, approximation excellent. She moved to the next patient without another word. Eddie watched her disappear around the corner of the trauma bay, then looked down at his forearm. The stitching was flawless. Tournament-quality work. The kind of stitching that would heal without scarring if he followed aftercare protocols. Tactical combat casualty care, translated into civilian trauma, executed with the precision of someone who'd done it when the alternative was watching your partner bleed out on a mud compound in Helmand Province. He sat up slowly, moving his arm experimentally. No pain beyond the wound itself. Excellent nerve preservation. Perfect technique. Later that night, when Eddie Ramirez was discharged with his aftercare instructions and a follow-up appointment, he tried something. He pulled out his phone. Searched the VA database for Natalie Hayes and Senior Chief Petty Officer and SEAL Team and ran it through every veteran network he could access. Nothing came up. No record. No discharge papers. No retirement ceremony. No acknowledgement that she'd ever existed in any official capacity. It was like searching for a ghost, which is exactly what she was. Which is exactly what she'd been made to be. The phone call came at 2:27 p.m. on a Tuesday, from Dr. Hargrove's office on the 5th floor, his voice smooth as surgical steel cutting through the line to board member Richardson's direct extension. "Richard, Marcus Hargrove. I need to discuss a personnel concern before it becomes a patient safety issue." A pause, calculated. "We have a nurse on the ICU staff, 18 months, no prior work history we can verify, credentials that don't quite match up. I'm worried about documentation gaps. You know how liability works." Richardson, who owed Hargrove a favor from a golf outing in Scottsdale where certain indiscretions had been diplomatically forgotten, made a note on his desk calendar. One small mark. That was all it took to start a chain reaction. 20 minutes later, an email landed in board member Torres's inbox, sent from an anonymous hospital account that Hargrove had created 6 weeks prior using a burner laptop in the cafeteria's back corner. The subject line read, "Patient safety concern, staff credentialing issue." The email was precise. Professional. Devastating. "I've become aware of serious discrepancies in the employment verification process for a current ICU staff member. Her background check shows gaps in employment history dating back more than 3 years. References provided do not correspond with any verifiable institutions. Given our current audit cycle, this may constitute a compliance violation. Recommend immediate HR review before accreditation issues surface." Torres read it twice. The kind of email that made lawyers anxious. The kind that made board members schedule emergency calls. And then Hargrove made his third call, to Board Chair Sullivan, the one who had the actual authority to move pieces on this particular chessboard. "Sullivan, it's Marcus. We may have a staffing issue that needs attention before it becomes a regulatory problem." His voice carried the exact right amount of concern, not alarm, not vindictiveness, just the tone of a physician watching out for institutional integrity. "I've noticed inconsistencies in one nurse's background verification. Nothing criminal, but the paperwork doesn't track. I felt obligated to flag it." Sullivan, who had appointed Hargrove to 3 committees and whose daughter-in-law had been treated by him for a routine appendectomy, felt the weight of institutional responsibility settle on his shoulders. One call to HR. That was all it would take. Downstairs in the ICU, Natalie was unaware that her carefully constructed 18-month history was beginning to unravel at the seams, pulled apart by institutional machinery that didn't require proof, only the appearance of a problem. The Garrett family's father was deteriorating. She'd noticed the change first, a subtle shift in his color, the way his breathing had become slightly more labored, the monitors showing a gradual drift in oxygen saturation that most nurses would have overlooked but that she'd been trained to catch on battlefields where a 2% decline meant the difference between amputation and death. Internal bleeding. The surgical site was seeping, slow and persistent, the kind of hemorrhage that announced itself through vital signs that nobody else had flagged yet because the numbers were still technically within acceptable ranges. She found Hargrove at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the kind of deliberate focus that suggested he was performing the action of being busy rather than actually being urgently needed. "Dr. Hargrove." "Mr. Garrett. Room for 12. His oxygen saturation is declining. 94, then 92, now 91 and dropping. His heart rate is elevating, 108 now, 112 last time I checked. I think we're looking at post-operative bleed." Hargrove did not look up immediately. He finished writing something on the chart in front of him with a pen that looked expensive, the kind with a weight that suggested it cost more than her nursing education. "Nurse Hayes, I'm sure you'll agree that alarm is the enemy of clear thinking." He closed the chart slowly. "I'll be there momentarily. In the meantime, I need you in post-op recovery. We're short-staffed today." "Doctor, his vitals are." "That's an order, Nurse Hayes." His eyes met hers for exactly 2 seconds, a look that contained a message underneath the surface words, "This is about power, and you don't have any." She turned toward the post-op wing, but her eyes stayed fixed on room for 12 through the corridor's glass partition. Through the window, she watched Hargrove enter the room. She watched him check the monitors. She watched him look at his phone instead of the patient's chest for 37 seconds. She watched him make no move toward emergency protocols, no call to rapid response, no acceleration of anything except, perhaps, his own career advancement. The automated alerts triggered 5 minutes later. The system's algorithms caught what Hargrove's focus had not. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. Rapid response team moved like water flowing downhill, inevitable and fast, finding Mr. Garrett's blood pressure dropping toward shock, finding the surgical site bleeding slowly but steadily into his abdomen, finding the kind of complication that resolved itself because 9 trained people arrived with equipment and protocol and the absence of whatever distraction Hargrove had been experiencing. Natalie continued working in post-op recovery, moving between patients, checking lines, monitoring vitals, her hand steady but her awareness fractured, her attention split between the work in front of her and the knowledge that Hargrove had chosen his phone over a deteriorating patient. 2 hours later, in HR Director Chen's office, a man with no relation to Marcus Chen, her spotter, though the coincidence of the name made her chest tighten when she heard it used in the hospital hallways, Hargrove filed a formal complaint. This one had his signature, his credentials, his full authority behind it. Nurse Hayes repeatedly questioned my clinical judgment in front of the Garrett family, he told Chen, whose face bore the expression of someone navigating bureaucratic quicksand. During Mr. Garrett's post-operative care, she voiced concerns about his saturation levels in a manner that undermined my authority and created a hostile environment. While I appreciate her diligence, patient confidence in physician leadership is essential. I felt it was necessary to document this pattern of insubordination. Chen nodded and took notes, his posture suggesting that this was, regrettably, not his first conversation of this kind with Dr. Hargrove. When Hargrove left, Chen sat alone at his desk, Natalie's file open in front of him, 18 months of employment, spotless performance evaluations, 0 patient complaints, and absolutely nothing before that date. He pulled up the verification system, clicked through to her background check documentation, and found what Hargrove had already discovered: the employment history before Sacred Heart didn't exist. Not in a way that left traces. Not in a way that could be verified through normal channels. A nurse with no past. That was either a deliberate fabrication, documentation fraud, or something else entirely, something that made Chen's military training kick in with the recognition of a very specific kind of security clearance pattern. He made a call to the state nursing board, his voice careful, his words precise. "This is Director Chen at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver. We have a staff credentialing question that needs clarification. Natalie Hayes, Colorado RN license number." He paused as Chen looked at the file. "We found some inconsistencies in her background verification and want to ensure all documentation is in order before we proceed." The nurse on the other end of the line assured him they would initiate a preliminary review. What happened next would be slow, bureaucratic, the kind of process that took weeks and left no visible scars until everything suddenly unraveled at once. In the parking garage, in the silence of her car, Natalie gripped the steering wheel with hands that had held 17 Marines together as they bled out under fire, hands that had performed needle decompression on collapsed lungs while mortars fell like rain, hands that had been trained to be steadier than her own heart could ever be. The faded unit patch was visible through the open collar of her jacket, the insignia she'd cut from her dress uniform before the military erased her, before Sanjin became a classified wound that nobody was supposed to speak about, before she became a ghost. The phone was not ringing. Not yet. But Hargrove's machinery was moving, institutional weight accumulating, invisible pressure building like weather before a storm. She started the car engine and drove home through the Denver streets, past the cherry blossoms that nobody ever seemed to notice, to an apartment that contained 3 changes of clothes, a photograph she kept wrapped in plastic, and the accumulating certainty that the 18 months of silence had just ended. 11:19 p.m. ICU visiting hours had ended 3 hours ago, and the unit had settled into its thin-walled quiet, ventilators cycling, monitors beeping their steady electronic lullaby, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a color that didn't exist in nature. Natalie was restocking the supply room when the sound came, a crash so violent it seemed to crack the air itself. The security doors weren't supposed to open from the outside. A man 6'5", maybe more, came through them like a wrecking ball. His pupils were blown wide enough you could see the darkness in them from across the unit. His mouth was moving but the screaming came out wrong, chemically distorted, the voice of someone whose nervous system was operating on borrowed time and burning chemicals. "Give me the drugs. I want the pills. Give me the opioids or I start breaking skulls." He was holding a tire iron. Just gripping it, letting the weight hang, letting everyone see it. The tire iron was real. Everything else in his body was a simulation running on methamphetamine and whatever else he'd ingested to reach this level of non-negotiable rage. He swung it at a medication cart near the nursing station, not a test swing, a full commitment, and glass exploded like a scream. Ampules shattered across tile. The sound was sharp, immediate, the acoustic signature of something irreplaceable being destroyed in seconds. 2 nurses behind the station dropped without being told. Smart. The attending physician, not Hargrove, actually made eye contact for half a second before backing away. But Dr. Marcus Hargrove, standing in the corridor near the trauma bay, did something different. He backed against the wall, hands up, every muscle in his body broadcasting surrender. His eyes found Vance, that was the attacker's name, something Natalie's training would file away in the part of her brain that catalogued threats, and Hargrove's expression was calculating. He was already thinking. Already deciding how this would be useful to him. Natalie stepped out of the supply room. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her breathing was something she'd learned in 2008, a pattern that could be maintained indefinitely, that kept the heart rate low enough for precision work while adrenaline ran hot through the blood. She'd held this breath through sandstorms and firefights, and the moment Marcus Chen stopped breathing in her arms, she could hold it through this. "Sir," she said. Her voice was quiet. She wasn't using a nurse's voice, the soft, placating tone designed to de-escalate. She was using the voice that came from somewhere deeper, the one that had given orders to 19-year-old Marines who outweighed her by 60 pounds. "I need you to put that down." Vance's head swiveled toward her like a gun turret finding a target. For a moment he just looked at her, this small woman, 5'4" maybe, 130 pounds soaking wet, stepping forward while everyone else was backing away. His pupils dilated further, which shouldn't have been possible, and then his mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a laugh. "You," he said. "You're gonna stop me? Little girl." His mistake was assuming her small frame meant weakness. People made that mistake all the time. It was a statistical advantage. It meant they committed to motions instead of holding back. It meant they swung for the fence when they should have been protecting their center line. He raised the tire iron over his shoulder and swung at her head in a wide, committed arc. The kind of swing that would have caved in a skull if it landed. The kind of swing that left every joint in his body broadcasting his intentions for the full arc of motion. Natalie stepped forward, not back. Her right hand came up in a precise movement, not a block, but a guide, her palm meeting the inside of his elbow at exactly the point where she could redirect his momentum without resisting it. Her left hand followed, meeting his wrist, her body sliding beneath his center line as the tire iron whistled past her head close enough that the displacement of air moved her hair. Muscle memory didn't take over. She was entirely present. She had learned this movement from a Navy SEAL instructor in Virginia Beach in 2005, drilling it 10,000 times until it lived in her nervous system like a reflex. The motion was exact, inside control, leverage through the wrist and elbow, rotation of his own momentum turned against him. She felt the joint lock bind, not painful yet, but promising, the kind of lock where pain would arrive immediately if he tried to resist. 1 second. Maybe 2. Vance dropped to his knees like something had cut his strings. The tire iron clattering away across the tile floor made a sound like a bell. His face hit the ground next to it. Natalie's left knee was on his spine, her weight distributed through her calf. She was breathing evenly. Her hands were positioned for follow-up if he moved. Her eyes were completely clear. Security arrived 17 seconds later, which was 16 seconds slower than the movement had taken. They found Natalie already off him, already standing back, already returning to the composure of a trauma ICU nurse. The attacker was face down, gasping, already in handcuffs. The medication cart was still scattered. One of the nurses behind the station was crying quietly. The attending was staring at Natalie like she'd just performed a miracle or a murder, he wasn't sure which, and the uncertainty was making his face pale. Natalie moved to the medication station and began cleaning up glass without being asked. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she spoke to the attending, was professional and precise, code blue page for the crash victim in Bay 3. Tension pneumothorax, needs decompression. The attending blinked. Nodded. Moved toward the bay. By the time the trauma team had assembled, Natalie had the equipment ready. Angiocath needle, 14 gauge, the right size, the right tool. The crash victim was a motorcycle driver, admitted 40 minutes earlier with multiple injuries, and his left lung had finally collapsed from the pressure of blood and air accumulating in his pleural space. His oxygen saturation was crashing, 87, 84, 81. His blood pressure was dropping. The resident was still pulling on gloves. Natalie didn't wait for permission. She palpated the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark that was right there if you knew how to read a human body like a map. Her fingers moved with the unhesitating precision of someone who had done this in tents and ruins and the back of a Chinook helicopter. The needle went in at a precise angle. She felt the give, the fascia, the muscle, then the membrane. The release came with a sound like air escaping from a tire. A hiss. Audible relief. The decompression of pressure that had been killing the patient in real time. The resident watched, mouth opened slightly. Dr. Hargrove, standing at the entrance to the trauma bay, had his phone out already. His fingers were moving. His face had that specific expression it got when he was calculating something, weighing advantage, measuring risk, deciding what would be most useful to him. Watch for the release, Natalie told the resident, not asked, told, as the needle released its burden. Oxygen should climb. It did. 81, 84. 89, 94. Normal. The patient's color changed in seconds. His blood pressure stopped falling. The machines reported it back, sinus rhythm, stable vitals, a person pulled back from the edge. Natalie stepped back from the trauma bay, already beginning to pull off her gloves. Her breathing was still controlled. Her hands were already moving to the next task. She'd done this 100 times, saved a person and then stepped back and let the system proceed without her. Security had Vance in restraints now, his anger collapsing into incoherence as the methamphetamine began to metabolize, as his body registered that he'd lost. The ICU was returning to its normal state, beeping, cycling, the sound of people doing the work of keeping humans alive. Nobody had seen anything except what they'd needed to see. By 1:38 a.m., Dr. Hargrove had made 3 phone calls. The first was to board member Richardson, who owed him favors from a billing consulting contract 5 years back. The second was to Dr. Patricia Vance, the chief medical officer, with whom Hargrove had golfed for 2 seasons. The third was directly to the state nursing board's after-hours complaint line, where he left a detailed voice message about unauthorized advanced procedures being performed by a nurse with unverifiable credentials. At 1:06 a.m., he sent an email to HR Director Chen marked urgent with an anonymous tip, routed through a temporary email account, just detailed enough to be damning, about employment history discrepancies and possible credential fraud. The machinery was moving now. Federal rules, hospital policy, standard procedures. He didn't need to do anything else. The system would do the work. The system was excellent at destroying people once you fed it the right information. By 6:45 a.m., Natalie was sitting in Administrator Walsh's office. The office was too warm. There was a framed photo of Walsh's family on his desk, 2 children, both blonde, both smiling in that professional way people smiled for photographers. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," Walsh said. He wasn't looking at her directly. His hands were folded on the desk. "Security will escort you to retrieve your belongings." "May I ask why?" Natalie's voice was careful. Neutral. The voice of someone who knew better than to argue with institutional power. "Credential concerns that have come to light. A security incident. And certain irregularities in your background check." She didn't ask for details. She didn't argue. She stood up, said thank you for the opportunity, and walked to her locker. The cardboard box was something she'd taken from the supply room weeks ago, a box that had held saline bags, that smelled like sterile packaging. She packed quickly. The cracked mug that her son had given her on Mother's Day 3 years ago, "World's Best Mom," printed in childish letters, went in first. Then the dying succulent, a plant that had somehow survived on the little sunlight that made it through the ICU window. She'd been watering it for 6 months, watching the leaves thin and curl, knowing it was probably going to die but watering it anyway. Last was the photo. She kept it wrapped in plastic in the bottom of her locker, taped to the inside. Her and spotter Marcus Chen, Sanjin Province, April 2009. Both in full combat gear. Marcus was smiling the kind of smile that said he believed everything was going to be fine, that the mission would go well, that they'd all come home. She was looking at him like she knew better but loved him anyway. 3 weeks later, he stopped breathing. She put the photo in the box, sealed it with her hands, and walked out through the emergency department at 7:15 a.m. with a security guard following 10 feet behind her. The rain started as she reached the bus stop on Evans Avenue. Not a gentle rain, hard rain, the kind that hammered the pavement like applause from an angry audience. The bus stop had a shelter, but it was broken, the plexiglass clouded with scratches, so the rain came through anyway. Natalie stood there in her civilian clothes, jeans and a dark jacket, holding the cardboard box against her chest like it contained something fragile. Buses passed. She didn't board any of them. Her hands were steady, but her mind was somewhere else, in a hospital room where a patient was stabilizing without her, in a trauma bay where the system would figure out how to function, in a network of communications that had no idea how to find her anymore because 18 months ago, the military had decided she didn't exist. The rain fell harder. Her hair was soaked now, plastered against her skull. The box was getting wet at the edges. Inside, the photo in its plastic wrapper would be fine. The succulent probably wouldn't care. The mug had survived worse than weather. She stood at that bus stop for 30 minutes, watching the rain, watching the traffic, watching the city move around her like she was a stone in a river. Nobody noticed her. Nobody ever did. That had been the point of all of this, to be invisible, to be safe, to be nobody at all. But invisible people don't stop attackers with tire irons. Invisible people don't perform emergency medical procedures with field surgical precision. Invisible people don't leave traces. And traces, once left, begin to matter. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a tragedy nobody wanted to witness. Natalie stood at the bus stop on Federal Boulevard, the cardboard box balanced against her chest, its edges already soggy from the downpour. 18 months at Sacred Heart Hospital. 18 months of moving like a ghost through the ICU, of keeping her head down, of answering to doctors who'd never asked her name. Gone. All of it, gone by 6:45 that morning when Administrator Walsh had handed her a manila envelope and told her not to come back. Inside the box, a cracked mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded blue letters, a Mother's Day gift from Jake when he was 9. A dying succulent, its leaves brown and curling, that she'd kept on the break room windowsill for 14 months without anyone noticing. And a photograph, worn at the edges, of Marcus Chen in full combat gear, his arms slung around her shoulders, both of them squinting into desert sun somewhere that didn't exist on any map she could show her son. Her spotter. The man who'd bled out in her arms in a collapsed schoolhouse in Sanjin while she applied tourniquets to what was left of his leg and whispered, stay with me, even though she'd known for 3 minutes already that the arithmetic of his injuries didn't add up to anything but a body bag. The bus pulled away without stopping. Natalie didn't look up. The rain soaked through her jacket, cold against the scars on her collarbone, entry wound, exit wound, the kind of topography that told stories she'd spent 7 years learning to forget. By evening, she'd moved most of her belongings into a storage unit on Morrison Avenue. Jake was at his friend's house. She'd texted him, work got crazy, staying late. Don't wait up. The lie felt like practice. She was good at lies. She'd built a career on them. What she didn't know was that her son had found the discharge papers from her medical separation, the one she'd kept in a locked drawer in her bedroom. He'd read the words Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, U.S. Navy SEAL Team 3, honorably discharged, and stared at them for 20 minutes. Then he'd called Commander Price, whose number was written on the back of a Christmas card from 2015, unsigned except for coordinates and a phone number. Within 36 hours, everything would change. Jake burst through Sacred Heart's main doors at 8:41 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, his backpack open, medals spilling into his shaking hands. 2 silver stars. 3 bronze stars with Valor. And a Navy Cross, the ribbon so faded it looked like watercolor instead of silk. He'd run all the way from the parking lot. His shirt was wet with rain and sweat. His voice cracked when he shouted, I need to see the administrator. My mother, she works here, she's a nurse, you have no idea who she is. The security guard at the front desk reached for his radio. Jake held up the medals, and the man's hand stopped. Something in those ribbons, that weight of metal, made the guard's throat close. He called upstairs. 14 minutes later, Administrator Walsh stood in the boardroom with 24 people, board members, department heads, the hospital's legal counsel. HR Director Chen was there too, having anticipated this moment with the kind of certainty that came from looking at security footage and metadata and understanding that the truth had a weight that would eventually pull everything else down. Jake's voice filled the room like a weapon. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Navy Special Warfare. He set the medals on the mahogany table, one by one. My mother. Natalie Hayes. She's been here for 18 months, and you fired her this morning without explanation. His hands were trembling, not from fear but from rage, the kind that 17-year-olds carry when they understand they've been protected by a lie and that lie just evaporated. Do you know who you just fired? Walsh lifted the framed citation with trembling hands, the one Jake had brought from Natalie's closet, tucked behind winter coats. His voice was hollow when he read aloud, for extraordinary heroism and personal valor in the face of enemy fire at Sanjin, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, on the 2nd of September, 2009. Senior Chief Hayes led a direct action raid on a Taliban command center, secured the objective under sustained small arms and RPG fire, and coordinated the evacuation of 17 Marines from a collapsed building structure. Her tactical decisions and medical expertise under extreme duress resulted in 0 additional casualties. Walsh's hands shook so badly the paper nearly fell. She brought home every single one of those men. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, that steady electrical hum of institutions trying to function normally while everything inside them collapsed. Then a man stood from the back row. 62 years old, barrel-chested, khakis and a navy windbreaker, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Commander Price, retired SEAL team coordinator, the man who'd written half of Natalie's commendations. His voice carried like thunder. I supervised her development. 2 silver stars. He paused. The words landed like stones. 3 bronze stars with valor. 5 years of continuous operational deployment. Another pause. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. And a Navy Cross that the Pentagon couldn't publicly award because she was never supposed to exist. Classified operation. Need-to-know basis. The Pentagon erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes from every database in 2011 because her presence at Sanjin would have exposed a black site operation that's still classified. Board member Richardson started to speak. Price cut him off with a single gesture. Your hospital fired a decorated Navy SEAL this morning because a corrupt doctor made a phone call. She was going to expose his insurance fraud scheme. So he arranged her disappearance. Price's eyes moved around the room like a targeting laser. That's called witness intimidation. That's called attempted coercion of a federal witness. That's a federal crime. Then HR Director Chen stepped forward, holding a hard drive no bigger than a thumb. His voice was calm, the voice of someone who'd served 12 years in the Marine Corps and knew exactly how to deliver bad news. Dr. Hargrove tried to delete 14 security files last night. Access logs, patient interactions, footage from the ICU. He used his office computer between 11:34 p.m. and 12:17 a.m. Chen's jaw was set like reinforced concrete. I saved every frame and reported him to federal investigators for Medicare fraud at 0600 this morning. FBI Economic Crimes Unit is in his office right now. They've seized his computer, his files, his personal phone records. By 2 p.m., Dr. Marcus Hargrove was in federal custody. By 4 p.m., his medical license was suspended. By 6 p.m., his wife had left him. The pharmaceutical kickback scheme that had funded his lifestyle, the $847,000 in unmarked payments, the shell companies in Delaware, the inflated billing for procedures that never happened, all of it unraveled like a knit sweater with a single thread pulled. Within 72 hours, he'd been indicted on 4 counts of Medicare fraud, 2 counts of witness intimidation, and 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice. 6 months later, Natalie walked past a strip mall on Evans Avenue in suburban Denver, Jake beside her talking about his college applications. Behind a folding table with a banner reading discount insurance quotes, licensed agent, Marcus Hargrove sat in a cheap polo shirt, his face hollowed out like a skull that hadn't been buried yet. Business cards in a plastic holder. A stack of flyers weighted down against the October breeze. He'd lost 40 pounds. His eyes found her on the sidewalk. She didn't slow down, but their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. His dropped to his shoes. The kind of broken that comes from knowing everyone in a 3-mile radius now knows exactly what you are. She kept walking. Jake didn't even notice. He was telling her about Northwestern's pre-med program, about how he wanted to specialize in emergency medicine. "I want to be like you, Mom," he said, and she reached over and squeezed his shoulder, her hand steady in a way it hadn't been in 7 years. Inside Sacred Heart, the ICU break room had been renovated. New paint. New tables. And above the nurse's station, mounted in a glass shadow box with museum-quality framing, hung Natalie's faded Special Warfare Unit patch. The threadbare fabric, the stitching that had held it in place inside her jacket lining for 18 months, was now preserved like a relic. A simple brass plaque below read, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, USN, Navy Special Warfare, 2001 to 2011. When Eddie Ramirez came for his follow-up appointment 3 weeks after the revelation, he stood in front of that patch for 5 seconds without moving. His left hand came up in salute. Nobody had taught him to. It was instinct, the kind of respect that warriors give to other warriors when the world finally stops pretending they don't exist. Then he nodded and moved on. Natalie worked her shifts now without the weight of invisibility. She laughed with staff during coffee breaks. She mentored new nurses on protocol and precision. She questioned residents when their dosages didn't align with patient history, her voice clear and firm, no apology in it. During morning rounds, she stopped a resident from administering a medication that would have caused a severe drug interaction. She'd seen the chart for less than 3 seconds, and her pattern recognition, honed in trauma situations where you have 4 seconds to make decisions that determine whether people live or die, had caught what 3 other people had missed. The resident thanked her. The attending physician thanked her. Nobody called her just a nurse anymore. Nobody needed to. The truth had a way of changing how people looked at you. It wasn't just about the medals or the rank or the history. It was about watching someone move with the kind of certainty that comes from having held someone else's life in her hands and knowing, with absolute clarity, what matters and what doesn't. Natalie Hayes wasn't invisible anymore. She was exactly who she'd always been, a warrior, a healer, a woman who'd spent 18 months learning patience and another 6 months learning that patience had an end point. The patch in the glass case above the nurse's station caught the morning light, its thread still visible, still real, still there. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Sometimes you just need the courage to stop hiding who you are. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever underestimated someone who turned out to be extraordinary, please like, subscribe, and comment. Tell us, what would you do if the person you judged most harshly turned out to be a hero? We'd love to hear your thoughts.